So as Alex mentioned, I'm Philip. I work as a senior consultant at Redify. I'm also a C# MVP. I've written a book and I've done some Prolosite courses. There might be a Prolosite course coming up about Xamarin, so keep an eye out. I know there's a couple of other ones out there regarding cross-platform development, but there might be one regarding Xamarin 3. So keep an eye out for that. You can follow me on Twitter. Just interrupt me if you have any questions. So Xamarin.Forms introduces a new concept to the UI development for these three devices. Previously, we've seen how we can create these applications, UIs, using either the storyboarding for iOS, we can use the nib files, we have the Android XML, and we have the SAML for Windows Phone. Xamarin.Forms introduces something entirely new that makes it much easier. So it's about building native UIs for these three platforms, using one single shared code library and writing everything in C#. So we've seen this approach quite a lot. So if you'd asked me a couple of months ago what I thought was coming next from Xamarin, I would probably not have expected an update to the UI library. In fact, I had a discussion with one of the guys in here about that regarding MVVM cross and using that for the UI in your applications. And I thought that, why would you ever want to do shared UI? All these devices work differently. There's really no common thing between the devices, so I wouldn't even bother trying to abstract that and work with something that is generic to all these devices. Turns out that we just haven't gotten anything to market that solves this problem in a good way. Until Xamarin.Forms, that is. So what they're doing is that they're finding all these commonalities between the different platforms. They're spotting all the different controls on all the different platforms that are common to all the devices. And they're letting us interact with that using one code line for each controller, as an example. So I'll be showing you a couple of demos regarding this and showing you how you can get started with Xamarin.Forms, going into what kind of controls you can use, how you set up your first Xamarin.Forms project, and what might be things you need to think about. So how many of you have seen something about Xamarin.Forms before? So a bunch of you. It might be some repetitive things in here, so let me know if you want to see something else. If you have any questions regarding some more advanced stuff, I know who to talk to. So please don't ask me too advanced stuff. I'm just joking. So if we take a look at what we've done before, we've had all these different types of UI principles. So for Android, we've done one pattern. For iOS, we've done one pattern. Both of them use sort of a MVC pattern. And coming to Windows Phone, we have the MVVM pattern. Now coming to Xamarin.Forms, we have a common pattern that we want to use on all our devices. So we have an MVVM pattern that lets us create code in two different ways. And I'll be going into these two types of ways of creating that code in just a moment. Basically, it means that we can quickly create something that is a native user interface. And it's really important to think about that this is really a native user interface. So when we do anything in Xamarin, it compiles down to something that runs natively. And I know that a lot of people question this and think, how can I write something in C# and have that natively run on all my devices? All the devices work differently, all the devices have different runtimes, but at the end, Xamarin solves all that for us. And one thing to really think about here is that when I use elements inside Xamarin.Forms, they really map to something that is native on that platform. So if I use a button inside Xamarin.Forms, that will map to a UI button on iOS, it will map to a button in SAML and a button in XML. And the same goes for things like WebView and other things, they map to the native controls. So this means that when I introduce Xamarin.Forms and use this abstraction on top of the UI, I still get the native feeling. There's still a native performance. I've seen some performance penalties. They're working on some small tweaks because they might not be perfect on all the cases, but most of the cases it's just the developer using the API wrong. So they just need to tweak that to make you use it correctly. And another thing is that people tend to ask me, so if I go this Xamarin.Forms way, I have a lot of time invested in nib files and storyboards or the other XML files or SAML. The thing is that you can mix and match as much as you want. So you can take your nib files, you can navigate to that. You can navigate to your controllers that you have in iOS and the activities that you have in Android and the things that you have in Windows Phone. So that's all crossing boundaries as much as you want. So they're just solving problems. They're not really introducing any new ones. So when we start talking about the Xamarin.Forms here, you'll hear a couple of different concepts. The first one is the pages. So everything is a page inside the Xamarin.Forms application. We start off with one page that can consist of something, either it's a content page, it's a master detail page, it's a navigation page, a tab page, or a carousel. If you're an iOS developer, you're probably mostly familiar with the navigation and the tab one. Lately, we've seen this master detail page as well in applications like Facebook. However, the tab page, how would that look on Windows Phone? And what do you expect to get on Android, right? So on Android, you get the tabs on the top. On iOS, you get the tabs on the bottom. And on Windows Phone, that's a pivot control. So they map really to their native UI principles. So these pages lets us do different things, and we combine these pages with something that we call layouts. The layout here lets us add things like a stack view. We can do absolute positioning, relative positioning. If you're coming from an iOS background, you know that everything is absolute positioning, and it's really hard to work with. So they've helped us abstract that away, so we can do stack panels, we can do absolute relative, we can do grid views, and all sorts of things. So this, together with the different pages, you can imagine that I set up a navigation page and I add a stack view to that. And then I can just push on my controls to that. But the controls coming out of Xamarin.Forms is quite a good bunch of controls. So they've abstracted about 40 controls so far. And if that's not enough, you can introduce your own ones. So let's say that you want to create some specific control for your own purpose. You can simply do that in Xamarin.Forms and tell Xamarin.Forms how to render that on each platform. It's a bit more advanced, but if you really want to do that, you could do that. And that's really what happens behind the scenes with Xamarin.Forms. When they're mapping that down to a native control, they're just telling you how to render that. You can do buttons, date pickers, list views, labels, tables. It's really a bunch of really good controls. So let's take a look at how we can create an application using Xamarin.Forms. So I'm inside Visual Studio now, so I've hooked up to my Mac build host. I'm going to create a new Xamarin.Forms project. And you'll see here that the installed templates that I have here is a new one called Mobile Apps. Previously, we've found these under either iOS or Android. But now there's a new tab here called Mobile Apps. And we have a couple of different options. The first one is that I can create a portable class library. This means that Xamarin.Forms will create a portable class library that is referenced from these native projects. So we're not really getting rid of the idea of having one project per platform, so we still do that. But Xamarin.Forms is going to let us share about 100% of the code. And then we have this new shared project type, as Alec talked about before. What happens here is that we create the Xamarin.Forms code inside this shared code library, and when it compiles the iOS project, for instance, it takes that code and compiles that as a part of that project. I'm going to use the portable version here, because I find that the tooling in Visual Studio tends to be a bit not so perfect so far for these shared projects. They just released that with the update 2 coming a couple months ago for the purpose of Windows Store 8.1 and Windows Phone 8.1 applications. The idea behind that was that I want to share the SAML between all the Windows devices. So let's use the portable version here. I'll call this Newsreader. And this will set up the Xamarin.Forms project for us. We can see here on the bottom that it's connected to my Xamarin build host. It's always good to keep an eye out on that. And when this is finished creating everything, we should see 4 projects here. All right. So I have a couple of projects in here. The first one is the portable library here. Then we have an Android project. We have an iOS project and a Windows Phone project. Now this is targeting Windows Phone 8.1 so far. You could imagine the reason behind the shared code library that they might want to be able to target both Windows 8.1 and Windows Phone 8.1. And also with the release of Windows 9, you'll be able to run these modern apps in Windows. So you will probably be able to create that with Xamarin here as well. So taking a look at this portable class library that we have here, we simply have one file, which is called app.cs. Now this application file here defines what type of page this application returns. So it tells us that Xamarin.Forms is returning a, for instance, content page or a master detail page. And then we can add different controls and layouts to that. Then the different projects just references this. So I haven't done anything, I just created this project. So when I talk about sharing about 100% of the code, I'm talking about the code that I write, not the code that is generated by the compiler. If I wrote this in Notepad, it would probably be a bit more not shared code. So the Android project contains the main activity as we've probably seen before. So this is still looking like an Android application in Xamarin. They're using the principles from Android development. So we have something called an activity here. For iOS, we have something called the AppDelegate. And for Windows Phone, we have the main page. And they're all mapping to their native things, right? So taking a look at this app file that we have up here, zoom out now because the text is probably big enough. You'll see here that this application simply returns a new content page. It could have returned a master detail or a navigation page. I could have wrapped this content page inside a navigation page if I want to do that. So you can mix and match the Xamarin.Forms controls as much as you want. And on the content page, of course, I have something called content. I just simply set the content to a new label. It displays the text hello forms. And then I say to span this on to the sides and to the top and the bottom, and that centers my text. So if I run this here inside my iPhone simulator, setting the iOS project as the current one, just need to build the portable class library first, or else it's probably going to complain. So when starting this off, this pushes over the code to the Xamarin build host. The Xamarin build host is running inside my OS X instance, and what that does is that it simply tells Mono on my Mac to compile that using the Xamarin components. Then it hooks up to my iPad that I have here. Notice that this is a 6.1, so it might look a bit different than if I use the latest version of iOS. So hopefully this shows the text hello forms. So that's quite easy enough, right? I've added some text here. I didn't really expect anything weird to show up. Didn't expect any super duper application here, but consider that this code here runs on all my different devices. And all there is inside my native hookups is that for the Android activity, for instance, we're simply defining that we want to initialize the Xamarin.Forms. We want to fetch the page from the application. So we say app.getPage here, and then we call something inside the main activity that initializes that. And that will make more sense when we take a look at the iOS version. So inside the AppDelegate, there's a bunch of comments here. I don't know why. Probably harder to do iOS applications. So what it does in here is that it does the same thing. It calls the app and tries to return the page, tries to get the page, and then it converts that to a ViewController. And the ViewController is something that the iOS version and the iOS project will know about. So we can set that to the ViewController, and now you might understand that you can cross boundaries here. So if we know that this is a ViewController in here, we can probably navigate to this, and we can navigate from that to another ViewController that isn't really written in Xamarin.Forms. And finally, having a look at the Windows Phone version, it simply says again, initialize Xamarin.Forms. Sorry, the scrolling is a bit off. And then it says, set the content on this page here that I have to the page that I've converted to a UI element. So now it's converted to a UI principle that the Windows Phone project understands. So I didn't do anything to these native projects, but I'm still able to run this on all my different devices. So let's give it a try and run this on the Windows Phone as well. Let's see if that works. Sometimes connecting to a Windows emulator inside Parallels is terribly slow. Let's try running this on the device instead. Did you guys know about Project My Screen? If you have a Windows phone, it's the best app. So I have my phone here hooked up to my computer, and I could real time do like that. It's pretty amazing. Still can't seem to run the application though, so I don't blame Windows Phone for that. You'll just have to trust me that it works, right? It's the demo gods. So moving on. Alright, so inside here we could probably do something different. We could add different things to this UI here. We could say that instead of having a label here, we could say that we want to define a stack panel. So I can say that the content is a new stack panel, or stack layout, sorry. Stack panel is from Windows Phone development. Sorry, it's stuck in my head. So I can say that the children here is a bunch of controls. So I could say here that I want to create a new label, and I want to have one other label. Let's see if this works. So let's run this on the iPhone simulator. Let's set the startup project to the iOS project. Let's run that. Make sure it doesn't run here. Sometimes it doesn't show up the first time. That's because it doesn't compile the portable class library. So that's a bug in either my instance of Visual Studio or Xamarin.Forms. So sometimes when you're doing this, if it doesn't show up the first time, just go ahead and compile the portable class library and try and run the application again. And if it fails a second time, it's your fault. There we go. It's good. So now I've been able to add these two controls here. So if my Windows Phone worked, I could probably add that to Windows Phone as well. So instead of you having to look at me writing some code, I want to show you an application that I've written. And I want to go over the code that I've written in that application. And the code that I'm going to show here, I wrote that for an article for D&C magazine. So if you want to just read a copy of that instead and read that in text, it's available free as a PDF. All right. So this solution here contains the same amount of projects in regards of Xamarin.Forms. So I'm just going to close all the files that I don't want to start here. But I've added one more thing. So notice the icon here on the D&C newsreader. It looks a bit different than the normal project icon. That's because in this case, I'm using a shared library. So the code in here doesn't have any references, doesn't have any assemblies references inside it at all. So what happens is that when you use something inside this shared code library, it relies on what you've referenced in the library where you referenced this one. Does that make sense? So if I reference this shared code library inside Android, and I try to use something Android specific, it expects me to have that referenced inside the Android project. So that's why I'm saying the tooling is not really perfect yet. It might get you some headaches. So if you get a lot of weird compilation errors, you probably just forgotten to reference them. So I have the same thing in here. I actually haven't touched the Android, iOS, or Windows Phone project. I've just added this shared library, and what it simply does is that it references that like this. And it has a bit different reference symbol here as well. So it's not really referencing a library on your machine. It's referencing the files inside this project. You asked before about if there's a performance difference between referencing a library and doing file linking. If you reference a library, it probably adds 1 or 2 more calls on the IL level, and it adds a couple of more kilobytes because it needs to compile the assembly. But other than that, it's exactly the same amount of effort that it's taking the runtime in the compiler. So that's the thing that is referenced in all these projects. It's just referenced in newsreader shared projects. And then I have this portable class library down here. So I'm mixing portable class libraries with shared libraries, and I'm using this shared portable class library here to interact with an API that I have. So the idea of my application is that I want to go ahead and fetch some news from a website. So I have this web API that I'm listening to, and I'm just fetching some data from that. Just taking a look at what this repository may look like. It's simply calling a web endpoint, which is local list now, because I don't want to rely on the internet. I've done that too many times. So it simply relies on the system.net.http client. So I pulled that in from NuGet. This is a portable class library that is really important to remember. So I'm using the portable class library version of that. And I've also installed the base class library's async version. So I can do async and await. As you see down here, I'm using the await keyword here. So I'm referencing the BCL version of the async library. Then that's just deserialized, and I'm getting this inside my Xamarin.Forms application. It's not really that interesting. So what it returns, though, that's the interesting part. So it returns just a DTO, a data object that has these properties. So the idea here is that inside my Xamarin.Forms application, I want to create an application that simply binds to these here. I want to do the MVVM pattern, so I want to bind to the properties. So if I change them or someone else changed them, I want to be notified by that and be able to respond to that change. So having a look inside the application file, this might give you a good idea of what is happening here. I haven't mentioned that there's 2 ways of creating Xamarin.Forms applications. So by looking at the code in Xamarin.Forms that I showed you before, where it does content is equal to new label, is equal to new stack layout, if you've done any SAML at all, you see that that's really just the code resemblance of SAML. And the thing is that you can actually write Xamarin.Forms as SAML. There's not good tooling support for the SAML code yet. I hear that it's good support in Xamarin Studio. So if you're in Xamarin Studio doing Xamarin.Forms, you're probably going to get some IntelliSense. But here what I've done is that I've set up my application. It's still the same app here. It's called Get Main Page. So all my libraries and all my iOS, Android, and Windows Phone projects, they call this here at the start of their projects. Then I'm newing up a Xamarin News Hacker News page. That's simply a content page that I populate with some data. But instead of doing everything in here, I'm simply inheriting from a content page and setting everything up. And then what I'm doing is that I'm hooking up an event here saying that when my page appears, so there's an event on the content page that lets me override or attach to that event. So I can say that when you're appearing, I want to start loading the data. There's no point in me invoking my API when there's nothing showing. So this is an async event handler. I don't know if you didn't know that you could do async event handlers in line like this. So then I'm simply saying here that the page has a binding context. So again, if you've done MVVM or done Xamarin, done Windows Phone development or Windows Store application development, you probably dealt with some binding and stuff like before. So I'm setting the binding context to whatever is returned from this here. So this returns an enumerable of my Hacker News entries. So it's the entry that I want to bind to different properties on. And then at the bottom here, what I talked about before is that you can mix and match these different pages and these different layouts. So I'm setting up a navigation page here that simply wraps my content page. So if you imagine what happens here is that it takes the content that I have, it puts that in a navigation page. This gives me the navigation bar on top. So on iOS, we get the back button. On Windows Phone, that looks a bit different. On Android, you also get a back button, I reckon. So now taking a look at this, the page itself, that is the interesting part. So I've set this up doing these 2 different approaches. So the first one that I want to show you is the SAML version. So the SAML version simply looks like this. It's very, very similar to what we've seen in Windows Phone before. I'm setting up the content page. Remember I did the new content page before. I'm saying I have a stack layout here. Inside my stack layout, I have a list view. I don't really need to wrap this in a stack view, a stack layout, but I could add more controls in here and they would be added on top or after this control that I'm adding here. So I'm telling this to bind to whatever source that I've downloaded. So that's the entries that I've downloaded from the web. I'm saying that do something when I tap one of these. It's not really important right now. Set some property on my list view. And then this part here is the most interesting part. So I'm setting up the data template. I'm saying that when the data is bound, can you please just bind two labels that I have inside a stack layout to these two properties? And this is very similar. It looks identical to what I've done on Windows Phone and Windows Store applications before. So as you might imagine, there's a code behind file. And remember the untapped name there? If we take a look in here, we'll see that I have this event handler in here. I cringe a bit when I see code behinds in SAML files, but it works for this purpose. So what I'm doing here is that when I tap this item here, I expect to get the arguments that I tap on. So that's the entry that I tapped on. So it's a bound context that I tap on. And then what I simply do is that I create a new web view. I navigate to that page because there's a URL on my entry. So I can fetch that entry for the URL for the entry like that, because that's passed down as an argument to this event. And then I made my navigation public inside my application. That's the navigation bar, the navigation page that I wrap my content in. So I can tell this here to simply push a new page on top of it. I've seen people doing different types of navigation inside Xamarin.Forms, and I find doing the navigation page is the best one. It's not a leaky abstraction. It seems to always work. So what I'm doing here is that I'm telling it to asynchronously push a content page with that information on it. So running this application on iOS, we'll see what happens. So there's really not too much code behind this. Most code is to fetch all the data and work with all the data in the repository. And there's a little bit of setup to do in the Xamarin.Forms app file that I had. But more than that, it's really just some small SAML and something to handle click events and stuff like that. So as you see here, we've got the iPad iOS 6 layout. It doesn't look all too good, but if I run this here on a iOS 7 device, it will look completely different. So if I tap one of these here, it will give us that very nice navigation bar on top. It's setting the title. It lets me navigate to that page. And I can click the things in here, and it just loads that. Now, just to prove to you that this looks different, on iOS 7, I'll change the target. So from Visual Studio here, I can change the target to different platforms. So I pre-select iPad iOS 6 here. I'm going to select the iPhone Retina 3.5 running iOS 7.1. Now that I run this here, it's going to stop my emulator running iPad here, and then start the iOS emulator. Instead of having that very nice round UI, you're going to have the flat UI that is iOS 7. If I click this here, we'll see that it looks a bit different. So it maps down to the native controls, and it works for older versions of iOS, it works for older versions of Android, and it's really nice, and it's really easy to work with. So with very little effort, I set this up here. It doesn't look all too good because I'm not a UX expert, but I have something to work with here. It's really easy for me to change that into looking good. So I said that there's two different ways of doing this. You can either do this with SAML, or you can do this with C#. So if I just exclude this file here, I'd like to show you what this looks like in just code. And I'm not going to write that. I have that predefined in here. So we have package page and a cell. So when I did the binding inside the SAML file, I set up that there's a view cell inside the data template. You have to do that manually with code if you want to do it all with code and no SAML. So this code here is what makes up for the code behind of that SAML file. It makes up for what is displayed from that entry. So before we just go too deep into that, I want to show you the page here itself. So I'm inheriting from content page. I have my list view here on top. I'm initializing that, setting the row height to 80. I'm doing the stack layout as I did before. I'm just adding this to that stack layout. Then I'm saying here, so when you're appearing, let's await for the entries to be loaded. Set that as an item template on my list view. Set the item template to whatever Hacker News entry cell is, the type of that, and set the item source to the entries. So that reference what I just showed you here. So we're setting that up in here. I'm saying that the title, which is a label here, bind that to whatever property is called title and so forth. So doing this with code is a bit more complex, I'd say, than doing this in XAML. The benefit of doing this in code is because you get the IntelliSense. You don't do that in XAML. So XAML is more trial and error. You have to be a bit more careful with what you're doing. It does take a couple of seconds to deploy and run your device, run your application on your device. So every second, I'd say, is really good if you can save that. So before I'm off, I want to show you one more thing. As I mentioned, there's a lot of controls made out there by Xamarin. There's about 40 of them. And they've made a project available on GitHub where you can download and run all the different types of controls and layouts they support. So I have downloaded that here. I'm not going to go over all these files, I promise, then you'll probably fall asleep. But I'll just run the iOS version on iOS 7, and I'll show you just a couple of these different controls. So this app is provided by Xamarin. It's available on their GitHub page. So as you see here, we can see what a label looks like. We can see what an image looks like when that's loaded. So it's waiting to be loaded there. We can see what a web view looks like. It loads the Xamarin web page for the blog. We can see a map. So if you want to integrate with a map inside Android, Windows Phone, and iOS, it's really easy to just add this map control. Just as I created a new label, I could create a new map. And then we have other things like we have sliders. And they all look very good. Looks like the native iOS slider. It's because it is the native slider. We have date pickers, which look awesome. Looks better on Windows Phone. Sorry. There's one more I want to show you down here. So we have the master detail page. So when I pull in here from the side, you see that this shows up here. You can change the color of that thing in the middle. Looks pretty good. So they're combining this master detail page with some page that is rendering within it, and it's really powerful. So I really recommend you to take a look at this here and try and play with all these different controls, because Xamarin.Forms is really the way to go. If you'd asked me half a year ago, I would probably never expect to get as good an abstraction on the UI as Xamarin.Forms. Do you have any questions? Or there first. Yeah.
Can I customize design of default controls for my system?
So the question is if you can customize the layout of the controls that are provided by Xamarin. Yes, I'd imagine you can do that. I haven't tried to do it, but you can do that, right?
Yeah. Basically, you can do whatever you want. You can break in and out of the model as much as you want.
Can I use XAML for it? Or
well, there's two different ways of creating controls. You can either do it within the Xamarin model, the Xamarin.Forms model. So you're creating a reusable control that's using all their elements, or you can completely break out and do it fully custom on each platform. So there's actually two ways to create controls, and you have both options. But preferably you want to try and stay within the model, because then you can use it on all platforms.
But you can't really do anything that you want to do. That's the thing to take away from that.
You can subclass the renderers with your own appearance to the Xamarin controls. So you still use same controls and get one thing.
Yeah, you can create your own renderers for your own controls or for their controls, I imagine, as well. That's one way to do it. Question over here?
Okay, my first question was really similar. Was about tuning. So I guess that's cool. The other one was Android fragments kind of mix things up a little bit. Then you kind of end up sometimes with different navigation hierarchies between your Android and iOS apps. When you want your app to take advantage of fragments on iOS, but there might still be separate view controllers on iOS.
So you're asking how would you handle the fragments inside Xamarin.Forms?
Yeah.
I actually don't know. I haven't tried. But you can break in and out of Xamarin.Forms and do the old way. So I'd imagine you can do it as you did before with the fragments and still apply some of that to Xamarin.Forms.
Okay.
Because when you use that on Android, it maps to the native things inside Android. So it's going to look the same inside the UI layer of Android.
Yeah.
So if you have a lot of UI-specific things inside your iOS, Android, or Windows Phone project, you're probably not going to end up sharing 100% of the code.
Can you actually have a form that maps to a fragment and then embed that, say, inside another form?
I don't know. I don't know too much about fragments, sorry. I can probably look it up.
Okay.
Or if you figure it out, you can come and present on it.
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. Can I have different design for example, Android tablets and Android phones, and for iPad and iPhone?
I think you can set up that, yep. Not sure how you do it, but do you know that, Michael?
For iOS, you'd have to actually do it in the iOS application, some logic there. Because I think they actually let you choose different layout options for the different platforms, but not for the different tablet or iPhone. So you have to actually create something natively, I think.
You can make it responsive to an extent, but then you're probably not going to take full advantage of the space you've got on a tablet.
Yeah, because it's SAML, so you can do the same thing you would do on Windows, right? So Windows is all different devices, and when you talk about the modern apps, they kind of extend themselves to larger screens and become smaller for smaller ones. So you'll do the same for the larger tablets, but I don't imagine it's as simple as just making a switch to make it look completely different for a tablet.
But you can use two different views for the same model, depending on the device you are running.
Yeah, but you'd have to do some specific logic, I'd imagine, inside the UI layers. So if you're running on Android, it has to detect if it's a tablet or if it's a phone.
Yeah, there's something called an IDM, which is there. You can detect both the OS as well as whether it's a tablet or a phone. And based on that, you can actually switch views.
Yeah. Great. More questions?
Do we have both for these samples, both XAML-based and I really don't know.
The access to sample-based samples are really bad right now. They have a couple of projects on GitHub, but these are not sample. These are all code. So just showing you the projects in here real quickly, you'll see that there's just a bunch of code files. So you have all these files here corresponding to the different pages. So there's no SAML in here, but there is a SAML demo on their GitHub page as well. They're building that up because more people are asking for it. But I think they're holding off on more SAML stuff until they have a really good SAML designer.
I see there's a book on its way as well. Charles Petzold made a SAML Xamarin.Forms Pro.
Oh, that's cool. Any more questions? Yep.
Do you have an idea how you would code up a form that in an iOS with a UI table view, you can actually have cells that resize themselves? Do you have an idea how you would do that?
How you would code up a table view with a resizable cell?
Yeah, because the user might press a button and that would add some additional content.
Yeah, sure. You would probably do the same as you'd imagine doing on iOS or Android or Windows Phone in SAML. So if you've done any SAML before, you can just change the size, and that would most likely just work.
So you have like a stack panel or something in that?
Yep. You just change the height of the stack panel. That will re-render. So you have access to all the iNotify property change and all that, so you can really do all the MVVM stuff that you probably have done maybe in Silverlight or WPF before. Right. Any other questions, or I'll hand over to Oleg again?
Yeah. Is there an example of an app with a lot of custom stuff in it, or are most of the examples just stock UI?
Are there examples with a lot of custom stuff?
Yeah, where it breaks out of the model quite a bit.
There's a good video coming up on Xamarin.Hackday.com from Michael. There are a couple of custom rendering examples on GitHub, on their GitHub page. But I think if a lot of people request things like that, they'll certainly add that. And they're very open to discuss things to do that. There's a Java room called Xamarin. If you join that, there's a lot of guys from Xamarin helping out and asking questions. There's a couple of demos they have on their GitHub page. And
yeah, there's one on the progress bar, which is using custom renderer for the native.
Yep.
I think there's a couple of them.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so a very brief recap. Sorry, actually, Philip, could I ask you a favour? I'm getting some missed calls. You can call one back and see these pieces.
Sure. You sure I'm coming back?
So hopefully the pieces will be here soon. So just a quick recap, what we've covered. There was the first thing was the iOS designer for Xamarin, Xamarin Studio and Visual Studio. The Xamarin Studio enhancements, the NuGet package manager, a couple of other things. The different ways of sharing code. So you've seen some examples now of portable class library versus the shared projects, each with their own benefits and drawbacks, I think. And finally, Xamarin.Forms. And once you start digging, you'll find more, I'm sure. So the important stuff, if you really want the shirt, if you're desperately jealous of the shirt that was given out, if you go to Xamarin.com/shirt, as I said before, you download the source to an app, you fix a couple of issues in it, run it up, and you can order a shirt and a monkey. And if you want the F# version, or maybe if you want that as well, then you go to this URL and you get a slight variation on the app, and you can order an F# shirt as well. Sorry, was anyone still writing that one? You'll be able to download the presentation if you want to in a couple of days' time. Okay, so I mentioned Xamarin University before. I know a handful of people here have been through it. It's something that I've been through as well. I can thoroughly recommend it. If you know C# inside out already, then a fair bit of it will be covering ground that you know, but there's still enough meat to make it very worthwhile doing. There's still the certification at the end that is very worthwhile having. There are trainers all around the world. We've got, I think there's only one at the moment in Australia, that's Glenn Stevens up in Brisbane. I'm still trying to get him to come and present at one of these meetings. I've not spoken to him recently, but I see that he's RSVP'd for next month. So I've got to confirm if that's the one he'll be at. So, and Michael's nodding. You know more than I do about that. So.
And I was just nodding because it's a good idea.
Oh, okay, cool. I had spoken to him previously about coming in September, but I'll confirm whether that will be August instead, which would be great. But the time zone variation is really nice. I went through it as part of my work training program, but every now and then I had real project deadlines that had to be met, but I still wanted to do the course and couldn't do it during the day, so I then could do it in the evening. And there were a couple I did that started at midnight because I was a bit too keen. Okay, the next thing is, you'll see the dates there, October the 6th to the 10th is the Xamarin Annual Conference. I say annual, this is the second year that they're running. I didn't make it last year, so I'm really looking forward to going this year. Yet to meet people who are also going from Australia. I assume Glenn's going to be there. I think there might be a couple of us going. So if you are, then make yourself known to me at some point, and we can at least recognise each other when we get there. So yeah, that's the code to give you the 15% discount. I think it's 15% for the duration of July. And that's just where you can go to download the tools if you want to start using Xamarin and you haven't already. And some of you might recognise Craig Dunn on the right, who used to live in Sydney and spoke a few months ago now. So we get him over in Australia every now and then, so I'll try and get him to speak again at some point next time he's here. So are there any other questions anyone wants to fire at, other than was it the pieces?
Yeah.
Excellent. one point on the bar, I don't know how many of us are planning on heading to the bar. There is a tab there. Whether it will stretch to all of us, I'm not sure. So it might be a bit of a race, but I've got to get there and open it, so the queue will be behind me. All the Filip's contact details, my contact details are here, along with some useful URLs. There's some great communities that Microsoft provide to the mobile.NET developer environment. And yeah, you'll all know the group one already, I'm sure. But if you download the presentation, that's all there for reference. And onto the pizza, I think. And Rod, if we can hand over to you to bring the cake out.
Yeah.
Should probably do the cake after the pizza, but let's bring it out first anyway and get the photos. Thank you very much. See you next.
Want that?
Fantastic. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I need a lot of pizza.
Yep.
Yeah.